The village of Mbali lay nestled between rolling green hills, where the air was thick with the scent of wildflowers and the laughter of children echoed through the narrow paths lined with thatched huts. Life in the village moved at a gentle rhythm, dictated by the rise and fall of the sun, the seasons of harvest, and the songs of the elders who sat beneath the great baobab tree, telling stories of ancestors and spirits. Among the villagers, there was none as radiant as Zanele, a young woman whose beauty was whispered about even in neighboring settlements. But it was not just her striking features, her deep brown eyes that held the wisdom of 100 lifetimes, her skin that glowed like polished mahogany, or the graceful way she carried herself. It was something deeper, something rare. Zanele's heart was as kind as the rain that brought life to the earth. She was the first to rise at dawn, fetching water from the river before the village stirred. She wove baskets with the elderly women, laughing at their tales, and she helped the young boys carve wooden animals, encouraging them with gentle words. The mothers adored her, the children followed her like ducklings, and the young men stole glances at her when they thought she wasn't looking. But Zanele had little interest in their admiration. Her world revolved around her mother, the only family she had ever known. Her mother, Namaswatsi, had been widowed young, left to raise Zanele on her own. For years, it had been just the two of them, a bond unbreakable, woven with love and struggle. But life in the village was harsh for a woman alone, and when a man named Madota, strong, wealthy, and respected, asked for her hand, she accepted, hoping to secure a better future for herself and her daughter. With Madota came Bheka, his son from a previous marriage, a boy who from the moment he set eyes on Zanele, regarded her not as a sister, but as a rival. Bheka was everything Zanele was not. Where she was hard-working, he was idle. Where she was generous, he was selfish. He would rather sit beneath the shade of the great tree, chewing on sugarcane, than lift a finger to help in the fields. The village women often sighed, shaking their heads at his laziness, but his father, Madota, was blind to his faults, believing his son was destined for greatness. Zanele did not seek to compete with Bheka, but her very existence was an insult to him. It angered him to see the way people spoke of her, the way his own father seemed to admire her diligence. He could not understand why the elders praised her wisdom, why the traders in the marketplace gave her the best grains, or why the young men tripped over their feet when she walked by. Most of all, he hated the thought that if Madota were to pass, his wealth might be shared between them. As the days stretched into months, Bheka's resentment turned to something darker. He watched her closely, waiting for her to make a mistake, to show weakness. And then, one evening, as he loitered near the marketplace, he overheard whispers that sent his heart pounding with excitement. A wealthy merchant from a faraway land had come to the villages, offering riches beyond imagination. He sought young maidens of rare beauty to serve in his household, promising gold and fine cloth to any family willing to part with their daughters. The elders scoffed at the idea. What kind of man bought young women like cattle? But among the desperate and the greedy, the murmurs grew. A few families, burdened by poverty, considered the offer, some even disappearing in the dead of night with their daughters, vanishing without a trace. Bheka's mind worked quickly. He had no love for Zanele, and if he could rid himself of her while gaining wealth in return, was that not a perfect fate? No one would question her disappearance. A girl as beautiful as her would surely catch the merchant's eye, and with the right persuasion, he could make sure she never returned. That night, as the village slept beneath a sky heavy with stars, Bheka lay awake, a smile creeping onto his lips. The wheels of fate had begun to turn, and soon, Zanele's place in Mbali would be nothing more than a memory. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long golden streaks across the village of Mbali. It was a quiet afternoon, the kind where even the wind seemed to rest, letting the air grow thick with the scent of earth and ripening fruit. Zanele stood outside her family's hut, kneeling as she pounded millet in a wooden mortar, her arms moving rhythmically, her thoughts drifting to nothing in particular. Bheka watched her from a distance, his jaw tight, his fingers clenching and unclenching at his side. He had already made the arrangements. The traders, men who dealt in things whispered about in the dark, were waiting beyond the hills, eager for the rare prize he was about to hand over. All he needed was to lure Zanele away, away from the village, away from the eyes that loved her. He put on his best act before approaching, stumbling toward her with an urgency that made her pause mid-motion. "Zanele. It's Mother, she's taken ill." His voice cracked, his breath coming short as if he had run a great distance. "I went to fetch water, and when I returned, she could barely speak. We must go, quickly." Zanele's eyes widened with fear. Without hesitation, she wiped her hands on her wrap and hurried toward him. "Where is she? Did you call the healer?" "There is no time," he said, shaking his head. "The healer's hut is deep in the forest, far beyond the river. If we wait for someone else to go, it may be too late." She hesitated only for a second, looking toward the hut as if expecting to hear her mother's weak voice calling for her. But the urgency in Bheka's tone, the look of concern on his face, false as it was, pushed her forward. "Then let's go," she said. Bheka led the way, his steps steady, his heart thudding with anticipation. The path twisted through towering trees, their branches heavy with creeping vines. The deeper they went, the quieter the world became. No birds sang. Even the rustling of leaves seemed to hush as though the forest itself held its breath. Zanele walked behind him, quickening her pace to keep up. The path felt unfamiliar now, darker, more isolated than she remembered. The healer's hut, she realized, was in the opposite direction. "Bheka," she called, slowing her steps. "Are you sure this is the right way?" He didn't answer. Before she could speak again, movement flickered in the shadows. The first man came from the left, his face hidden beneath a cloth mask, his presence as sudden as a striking snake. Then another. And another. A circle of masked figures emerged from the darkness, their eyes glinting with something cruel and eager. Fear punched through Zanele's chest, a sharp, cold realization settling into her bones. She turned to Bheka, her lips parting to question, to plead, but she saw it then. The way he stood at ease, the way he didn't flinch at the sight of these men, the way his hands, once trembling in false worry, were now still, clenched around something bright, silver coins, freshly counted. "Bheka," she whispered, disbelief cracking her voice. "What have you done?" He smirked. "Something I should have done a long time ago." Before she could react, rough hands grabbed her from behind, jerking her backward. A thick cloth pressed against her mouth, muffling her scream. She kicked, struggled, but the men were strong, their grip iron. "Let her go," she tried to cry out, but the words came out muffled as another hand clamped over her mouth. "She's a fighter," one of the men chuckled, binding her wrists with thick rope. "The merchant will like that." Terror surged through her, wild and sharp. She twisted, tried to break free, but the ropes only dug into her skin, burning against her wrists. "Bheka," she gasped, her voice breaking with betrayal. "Please, don't do this." But Bheka only chuckled, tossing the silver coins in his palm before pocketing them. "Goodbye, Zanele. I'm sure you'll make someone a very fine servant." Her breath caught in her throat. She had always known Bheka hated her, but not like this. Not enough to sell her like cattle. The men dragged her through the underbrush, their laughter mingling with the distant rustling of trees. The last thing she saw before the forest swallowed her was Bheka standing motionless, watching her disappear, his smirk fading into shadow. The journey to the distant kingdom was a blur of misery and exhaustion. Zanele had lost count of the days she had spent in captivity, her wrists sore from the rough ropes, her ankles raw from being dragged across harsh terrain. The men who had taken her barely spoke to her, treating her like cargo, something to be sold, not someone to be heard. When they finally reached the distant kingdom, the air was thick with the scent of spices, sweat, and something rotten beneath the surface of grandeur. The city was unlike anything Zanele had ever seen, massive walls of stone, narrow winding streets filled with merchants shouting in strange tongues, and people draped in bright fabrics that shimmered under the sun. She was led through the crowded marketplace, past stalls overflowing with fruits she did not recognize and pots bubbling with unfamiliar food. But Zanele had no time to marvel. She was shoved forward, toward a raised platform where other captives stood, their faces hollow, their wrists bound like hers. The bidding began, voices rising, hands gesturing, men inspecting the captives like cattle. A tall, broad-shouldered man with a cruel smirk and heavy rings on his fingers stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the captives until it landed on Zanele. "I'll take that one," he said, tossing a bag of gold to the traders. The transaction was over in seconds. Zanele was dragged through the streets again, her heart pounding with fear and fury. She was brought to a sprawling estate, larger than anything she had ever seen, surrounded by high walls and guarded by men with weapons at their sides. Inside, marble floors gleamed under candlelight, and richly woven tapestries covered the walls. It was a house of wealth, but it was also a house of cruelty. Her new master was Jabari, a powerful merchant who controlled a vast trading empire. He was known for his riches, but more so for his ruthlessness. His wealth had been built on the backs of captives, and he ruled his household with an iron fist. His servants feared him, his enemies despised him, and his word was law. Zanele was thrust into servitude without mercy. She was ordered to clean, to cook, to carry heavy jars of water until her arms ached. The other captives in the house worked in silence, their eyes dull with hopelessness. The overseers, the guards who ensured obedience, were quick with their hands, striking anyone who dared to disobey. Zanele refused to break. Her defiance earned her punishment. When she spoke out, she was slapped. When she refused to bow her head, she was made to kneel on sharp stones for hours. When she hesitated in her tasks, the overseers beat her with wooden rods. But she did not beg. She did not weep. She would not give them that satisfaction. One night, after a particularly brutal beating, Zanele sat in the darkness of the servants' quarters, her body aching, her resolve hardening. She would not remain here forever. "You are strong," a voice whispered. Zanele turned her head and saw a woman sitting in the corner. Her face was lined with years of hardship, but her eyes held a quiet fire. "My name is Maida," she said. "And I have seen many girls come and go. You are different." Zanele studied her warily. "I will not be broken," she whispered. Maida nodded. "Then listen to me, and I will teach you how to survive." Over the following months, Maida became Zanele's only ally in the house of cruelty. She taught her how to navigate the estate, how to move unnoticed, how to steal scraps of food without being caught. She whispered secrets in the darkness: who could be bribed, who could be trusted, and who was the most dangerous of all. Most importantly, Maida told her about the traders. "These men have built their empire on the suffering of others," she said one evening as they scrubbed the floors. "But even the strongest walls have cracks. They think themselves invincible, but they have weaknesses." Zanele listened intently. She learned the movements of the traders, the hidden doors in the estate, the pathways that led to the docks where ships carried stolen lives to distant lands. She began to observe, to memorize, to plan. Years passed, but Zanele did not forget the betrayal that had brought her here. She did not forget the face of Bheka, the weight of the silver coins he had chosen over her. She was patient. She was waiting. And when the time came, she would be ready. The storm came like a gift from the gods, wild, furious, and blinding. The rain crashed against the rooftops, drowning out the sounds of the world, while thunder split the sky like an angry spirit. It was the perfect night for an escape. Zanele and Maida had spent years preparing for this moment. Every whispered plan, every stolen piece of knowledge, every calculated risk had led to this. There could be no mistakes. If they were caught, they would not be beaten, they would be killed. Under the cover of darkness, they moved swiftly through the estate, their soaked garments clinging to their bodies. The guards were seeking shelter from the storm, huddled under awnings and inside storage rooms, too distracted by the raging winds to notice the two shadows slipping through the servants' passage. The stables loomed ahead, the scent of wet hay thick in the air. Zanele's fingers trembled as she reached for the latch, pushing the wooden door open just enough for them to slip inside. The horses were restless, stamping their hooves and flicking their tails, uneasy from the storm. "That one," Maida whispered, pointing to a sturdy black stallion. Zanele didn't hesitate. She moved quickly, untying the reins, stroking the horse's damp mane to calm it. Maida climbed on first, then reached for Zanele, pulling her up behind her. The moment they burst from the stables, lightning illuminated the night, exposing them for just a second. A shout rang out. "Thieves! Stop them!" The alarm had been raised. The gates were closed, but Zanele had been watching for years, and she knew the weakness in the estate's defenses. "The side wall," she shouted over the rain. Maida yanked the reins, guiding the horse toward a narrow section of the stone wall. It was high, but not impossible. Behind them, the guards scrambled to mount their own horses, shouting orders, fumbling with weapons. "Faster!" Zanele urged. Maida gave a sharp kick, and the stallion surged forward, its powerful muscles propelling it toward the wall. With a mighty leap, the horse cleared the barrier just as an arrow whizzed past Zanele's ear. They landed hard on the other side, nearly losing balance, but Maida steadied them, driving the horse forward into the stormy night. The chase began. Through the rain, they heard the pounding of hooves behind them. The bounty hunters were relentless, their torches flickering in the darkness. The wilderness stretched ahead, a tangled maze of trees, rivers, and hills. If they could just reach the forest, they had a chance. The wind howled, carrying the scent of wet earth and desperation. Zanele clung to Maida, her heart slamming against her ribs as they charged into the undergrowth. Branches slapped against their faces, the ground uneven beneath the horses' hooves. Then came the river. The waters had risen with the storm, a raging torrent cutting through the land like an angry beast. There was no time to find another way, the hunters were closing in. "Hold on!" Maida shouted. With a final push, they drove the horse into the river. The cold water engulfed them instantly, dragging at their limbs. The horse struggled, snorting and kicking as the current pulled them downstream. Zanele fought to keep her grip, the rushing water filling her ears, her lungs burning as she gasped for air. The river spit them out on the opposite bank, where they collapsed, coughing and shivering. The horse had managed to climb out too, trembling but alive. The torches on the other side of the river hesitated. The bounty hunters paced along the edge, cursing. The water was too wild to cross. Zanele met Maida's eyes. They had done it. For days, they traveled through the wilderness, keeping to the shadows, scavenging what little they could. They hid in caves, their bodies pressed against the damp stone to stay warm. They waded through swamps, their feet sinking into the mud. They ate wild berries and roots, their stomachs hollow with hunger. But they survived. Finally, they crossed the border into a neighboring kingdom, a land unfamiliar but free. Zanele stood atop a rocky hill, looking back toward the land that had enslaved her, the land that had stolen years of her life. Her fists clenched at her sides, her jaw tightening. She had escaped, but she was not done. She would return. And she would have her vengeance. It had been years since Zanele had last stepped foot in the village, but now, as she rode along the dirt path leading to its heart, she felt no warmth, no nostalgia, only a quiet, simmering resolve. She was no longer the girl who had been dragged from this place in ropes, betrayed by her own blood. The years had reshaped her, reforged her in the fires of hardship. She had left as a helpless girl. She had returned as something else entirely. She sat tall on her horse, clad in a dark, flowing cloak that concealed much of her figure. The wind carried the scent of the land, smoke from cooking fires, the sweetness of ripe fruit, and the damp earth after an early morning rain. Mbali had not changed, but Zanele had. The people in the marketplace barely spared her a glance as she passed. To them, she was just another traveler, another foreign merchant from distant lands. No one recognized her, not the women selling woven baskets, not the old men haggling over dried fish, not even the children who played near the well where she once fetched water. She preferred it that way. Dismounting near the marketplace, she handed the reins of her horse to a young boy in exchange for a small coin. Then she pulled the hood of her cloak lower over her face and began to walk, listening, watching, learning. Bheka's name was everywhere. "He is a fine man," an elder was saying, his voice thick with admiration. came from nothing and built himself a fortune. He's not as generous as he used to be, a woman muttered, kneading dough between her fingers. I remember when he shared his grain freely. Now, he charges even the poorest among us. Zanele's lips pressed into a thin line. Bheka, a fine man? She continued moving through the village, stopping at different stalls, buying small items to keep up the illusion of a passing traveler. Every conversation she overheard, every glance she stole, painted a clearer picture. Bheka had grown wealthy. The same greed that had driven him to sell his own sister had now lifted him into the ranks of Mbali's most powerful men. He was respected, even feared. He had taken over much of the village trade, dealing in livestock, grains, and even rare goods from foreign lands. He lived in their old home, the place where Zanele had once found comfort in her mother's arms. Now, it belonged to him alone. But wealth had made him careless. She heard whispers of his arrogance, of the merchants he had cheated, the farmers he had forced into debt, the women he had taken without thought of consequence. He was no longer a desperate boy with nothing, he was a man who believed himself untouchable. That, Zanele thought, was his greatest weakness. She continued gathering information, moving with caution. It was not just Bheka she wanted to know about, it was her mother. She asked carefully, weaving questions into casual conversations, hiding her personal interest behind the mask of a curious stranger. When she finally learned the truth, her hands trembled at her sides. Her mother had suffered greatly after her disappearance. Some had whispered that she had lost her mind, wandering the village at night, calling out Zanele's name. Others said she had begged Bheka to search for his sister, but he had dismissed her, claiming Zanele had run away of her own free will. She had died not long after. Alone. Forgotten. The rage that rose in Zanele's chest was not the wild, helpless fury of a child. It was cold. Sharp. Controlled. She had come back to Mbali as a different woman. A woman with power. A woman with knowledge. A woman who understood how to dismantle a man like Bheka. She was not here to simply punish him. She was here to destroy him. Zanele sat in the heart of Mbali's marketplace, sipping from a clay cup filled with spiced tea, her gaze drifting lazily over the bustling crowd. Beneath her hooded cloak, her mind worked like a weaver's loom, threading together the final strands of her vengeance. Bheka would never see it coming. He had built his fortune on greed and betrayal, and it was greed that would now lead him to ruin. She had taken on a new identity, a noblewoman from a distant land, draped in wealth and mystery. Her garments were fine, embroidered with golden patterns that caught the light. She wore bracelets that clinked softly with each movement, a symbol of affluence that made even the most cautious men take notice. And Bheka was far from cautious. The moment she had made her presence known in the marketplace, her name spread like wildfire. Traders spoke of a wealthy merchant seeking business opportunities, a woman with knowledge of rare goods from lands far beyond the reach of Mbali. The village's powerful men, ever hungry for new alliances, had taken interest. Bheka, of course, had been the first to come forward. She had arranged a meeting at one of Mbali's finest inns, where oil lamps flickered in the dimly lit room, casting golden hues against the wooden walls. She sat at the table, calm, poised, her face partially veiled to maintain an air of mystery. Bheka entered with the confidence of a man who believed he owned the world. He was no longer the scrawny, bitter boy she had once known. He had grown broader, heavier, his fine robes proof of his wealth. But his eyes still carried the same greed, the same selfish hunger. He bowed slightly, the gesture more out of courtesy than respect. "I am honored to meet such a distinguished trader." Zanele smiled behind her veil. "The honor is mine, sir. I have heard much about the great merchant of Mbali." She watched as his chest swelled with pride. He was already falling into the trap. She told him tales of the foreign lands she had supposedly traveled, vast cities where gold flowed like rivers, where spices and silk were worth fortunes. She spoke of rare goods, exotic treasures that only a select few could acquire. And then, she laid the bait. I have recently come into possession of something truly remarkable, she said, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. A rare gemstone, unlike any seen in these lands. Buyers from the east are willing to pay a fortune, but there is a problem. Bheka leaned forward, eyes gleaming. What kind of problem? Zanele let out a soft sigh, feigning concern. I need safe passage to complete the deal. There are many who would seek to steal such treasure, and I require a trusted partner, a man of influence, someone with the means to protect such an investment. Bheka's expression darkened with suspicion for only a moment before greed clouded his judgment. And in return? A generous share, Zanele purred. 50% of the profits. He exhaled sharply, clearly doing calculations in his head. That is quite the offer. It is, she agreed, tilting her head. But I must be certain of my partner's commitment. I will need financial backing, an investment to secure the trade routes and ensure the safety of the transaction. He hesitated, but Zanele knew he was already too deep in the idea. The mere thought of such wealth had poisoned his reason. I have many assets, he said carefully. But I must see proof of this gemstone before I. Zanele slid a small, polished stone across the table. It was no ordinary gem, it was a piece of glass, expertly crafted to mimic the shimmer of a rare jewel. She had acquired it in the very lands where she had once been enslaved, knowing that someday, it would serve a purpose. Bheka picked it up, turning it in the light. His breath hitched. It is, his voice was thick with desire. Magnificent. Zanele smiled. Imagine a chest full of them. It was all he needed to hear. Over the following weeks, she led him deeper into the trap. She arranged meetings with supposed traders, men who were, in truth, actors paid handsomely to play their roles. She forged documents, creating the illusion of an international trade deal that required Bheka's investment. He gave her everything, his gold, his land, even his home as collateral. She watched as he signed away his wealth with shaking hands, believing himself on the brink of unimaginable fortune. And when the time came to collect his reward, he found nothing. The promised traders vanished. The contracts dissolved into meaningless ink on paper. The rare gemstone deal was nothing but smoke. And by the time he realized he had been deceived, it was too late. He had lost everything. The market square of Mbali was restless that afternoon, buzzing with whispers of Bheka's downfall. He had been a man of wealth, of influence, but now, he was a desperate man clinging to the edges of his own ruin. Zanele watched from the shadows, hidden beneath her veil, as Bheka stumbled through the village, sweat beading his brow. His fine robes were gone, replaced with tattered garments that barely clung to his frame. His once proud stride had become frantic, his confidence shattered like pottery against stone. He had lost everything. The merchants he once ruled over now laughed at his misery. The men who once sought his favor refused to meet his eyes. The women who once admired his wealth turned away in disgust. But Zanele knew Bheka. He was like a cornered beast, dangerous in his desperation. She had followed him, watched as he made his way to the edge of the village, where the shadows of the past awaited him. The slavers. The same vile men who had dragged Zanele from her home, who had bound her in chains and sold her to a life of torment, now stood before Bheka. He approached them like an old friend, forcing a smile as he extended a trembling hand. I have a proposal, he said, his voice low and urgent. I need gold, and you need bodies. I can help you. The slavers exchanged looks. And what do you have to sell, merchant? One of them sneered. From what we hear, you own nothing. Bheka clenched his jaw. I know the village. I know its secrets. I can get you more than you could imagine. Zanele had heard enough. She stepped forward, pulling back her hood, her face revealed for the first time in years. Gasps rippled through the crowd as eyes widened in recognition. Murmurs of disbelief spread like wildfire. It was her. Zanele. The girl who had been stolen, the girl who had vanished without a trace. The girl Bheka had betrayed. Bheka turned, his face draining of color. His lips parted, but no words came. "You look as if you've seen a ghost, brother," Zanele said, her voice smooth as silk, yet laced with steel. The entire village had gathered now, drawn by the spectacle unfolding before them. Zanele stepped closer, each movement deliberate, measured. "Tell them, Bheka," she said, her voice rising. "Tell them how you sold your own sister for a handful of silver. How you led me into the forest with lies, only to deliver me to these men." A shocked murmur ran through the crowd. Some gasped. Others turned to Bheka with newfound disgust. Bheka staggered back, his lips trembling. I didn't." Zanele didn't let him finish. "I was dragged away, bound like an animal," she continued, her voice unwavering. "I was sold into a land where no one spoke my tongue. I was beaten, worked like a mule, treated as less than nothing." Tears shone in the eyes of some of the villagers. Others looked upon Bheka with seething fury. Zanele's gaze never left his. "And where were you, brother?" she asked, voice sharp as a blade. "Were you grieving? Were you searching for me? No. You sat in our home, wearing fine robes, eating well, growing fat on your stolen wealth." Bheka shook his head wildly. It wasn't like that. You don't understand." "I understand perfectly," Zanele said coldly. "You are a coward. A traitor. A parasite." She turned to the villagers, her voice echoing through the square. "You call this man a leader? A merchant of honor? What honor is there in selling your own kin? What loyalty is there in betraying those who trust you?" The villagers erupted in anger. Shouts of fury filled the air. Women wept for the suffering Zanele had endured. Men clenched their fists, their once blind respect for Bheka turning to rage. Someone threw a stone. It struck Bheka's shoulder, making him stumble. Another followed. Then another. The slavers, sensing danger, began to back away, but Zanele turned her gaze upon them. "Take him," she commanded, her voice like thunder. The slavers hesitated. They had not expected this turn of events. "He wanted to sell you more slaves," she reminded them. "Let him pay the price instead." A slow, cruel grin spread across the slaver leader's face. Before Bheka could run, they seized him. He screamed, pleaded, fought, but there was no mercy left for him. Zanele watched as they shackled him, just as she had once been shackled. As they dragged him toward their waiting cart, his cries rang through the air, growing fainter with each step. And then he was gone. Justice had been served. Zanele stood before her mother's grave, the weight of the past heavy upon her shoulders. She had dreamed of this moment, of returning home, of wrapping her mother in her arms and telling her she was safe. But fate had been cruel. Her mother had died believing her daughter lost forever. Tears welled in Zanele's eyes. "I came back, Mama," she whispered. "I came back, but I was too late." The wind rustled the leaves, a gentle touch against her cheek. She closed her eyes, imagining it was her mother's hand, soothing her pain. Though she could not change the past, she could honor her mother's memory. She turned from the grave, gazing upon the village she had once called home. Mbali had been kind once, but it had also been blind, blind to the dangers that lurked within, blind to the suffering of its daughters. That would change. Zanele took the wealth she had acquired, the knowledge she had gained, and began to rebuild. She freed the debt-ridden farmers who had been trapped under Bheka's thumb. She ensured that no young girl would ever be stolen from her home again. She traveled beyond Mbali's borders, seeking out other women who had suffered as she had, offering them a chance at freedom, a chance to fight back. In time, her name became legend. They called her Zanele the Survivor. They whispered of the woman who had risen from slavery to power, who had brought justice to her betrayer, who had turned pain into strength. And in the stories, she was not just a woman, she was a force, a spirit of vengeance, a protector of the lost. But to herself, she was something simpler. She was a daughter who had come home.